Hello, welcome, or welcome back. Please have a seat. We're about to begin. Warning: the Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. These stories are told for entertainment and historical curiosity, but many of them come from a time when fairy tales were not written for children. They were warnings, passed down through generations. Tonight's story is one of the darker ones. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, these stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales, the versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? When most people hear the words fairy tale, they imagine magical kingdoms, heroic princes, and happy endings. But the earliest fairy tales were very different. They were part of oral folklore, told around fires and kitchen tables long before they were written down. Many of these stories were meant as warnings about the dangers of the world, strangers in the woods, deception, and betrayal. In the early 1800s, two German scholars named the Brothers Grimm began gathering these stories from villagers across Europe. What they recorded were not gentle bedtime stories. They were dark, strange, and sometimes brutal reflections of life in earlier centuries. This episode explores one of those lesser-known Grimm tales, a story about trust, danger, and a bride who discovered far too late what kind of man she had agreed to marry. Fairy tale fact: many of the Grimm stories share a common warning. Not every smiling stranger is who they claim to be. Stories about murderous husbands, dangerous lovers, and forbidden rooms appear across European folklore. These tales often served as cautionary stories about trust and survival. The story you're about to hear belongs to that tradition. Series 2. Episode 1. The Robber Bridegroom. There once lived a miller who had a beautiful daughter. One day, a wealthy man came to visit and asked for the girl's hand in marriage. The man was well dressed and spoke politely. To the miller, he seemed respectable enough, and so he agreed to the match. But the girl herself felt uneasy. There was something about the man she could not quite explain. Whenever she looked into his eyes, she felt a chill. Still, the wedding was arranged. One day the bridegroom told her she should visit his house in the forest, so she would know where she would live after their marriage. He gave her directions, but as she walked through the woods, she noticed strange things along the path. Birds sat in the branches above her, calling out warnings. "Turn back! Turn back! Beautiful bride!" But she continued walking until she reached the house. The place stood alone in the forest. No servants, no welcoming lights. The door creaked open when she pushed it. Inside the house, everything was silent. In the center of the room stood a bird in a cage. The bird cried out, turn back, beautiful bride. This house is full of murder and crime." Fear began to creep into her heart. She searched the house and eventually found a cellar door. Inside the cellar sat an old woman. The moment she saw the girl, the old woman whispered urgently, "You must leave this place at once. Your bridegroom is not what he seems. He and his companions are robbers. They bring young women here, kill them and steal everything they have." The bride trembled. Before she could escape, footsteps sounded above them. The robbers had returned. The old woman hid the girl behind a large barrel. Through the cracks, she watched as the robbers dragged another young woman into the cellar. The poor girl cried and begged for mercy, but the robbers paid no attention. They murdered her and began cutting the body apart. As they worked, one of the robbers sliced off the girl's finger, and the ring she wore flew through the air and landed behind the barrel, right in the bride's lap. Terrified, she clutched the finger tightly, but the robbers noticed the missing ring and began searching the cellar. They came closer and closer to the barrel. Just as they were about to discover her, the old woman shouted that the ring must have fallen into the straw. While the robbers searched the floor, the old woman quietly helped the bride slip away. Together they fled into the forest. The next day the bride returned home safely. Soon the wedding day arrived. Guests gathered for a great feast. As the bride sat among them, the bridegroom asked her to entertain the company with a story. She agreed. "I will tell you a dream," she said, and she began describing the house in the forest, the caged bird, the cellar, the murder, the severed finger. The room fell silent as she spoke. Then she placed the ring and the finger on the table. "This was no dream," she said calmly. "I saw it all." The bridegroom and his companions tried to flee, but the guests seized them. Justice quickly followed, and so the bride escaped the terrible fate that had awaited her. Please don't leave yet. We have another story. We know you'll really enjoy it. Fitcher's Bird. There once lived a powerful wizard named Fitcher. He would disguise himself as a poor beggar and travel from house to house. Whenever a young girl opened the door, he would seize her and carry her away to his house. There he gave her a key and an egg. "You may explore every room in the house," he told her. "But one room must remain locked. If you open that door, you will die." Curiosity soon overcame each girl. They opened the forbidden room. Inside, they discovered the bodies of other women, dismembered and piled in the corner. Fitcher would return, see the blood on the egg he had given them, and know they had broken his rule. Then he would kill them as well. But one girl proved clever. She opened the forbidden room, discovered the bodies of her sisters, and secretly restored them to life. When Fitcher returned, she hid her sisters safely away. Then she tricked the wizard into carrying baskets that he believed held gold, but actually contained the rescued girls. Finally, she disguised herself as Fitcher's Bird and escaped the house. Later, when Fitcher and his companions returned for the wedding celebration, the house was set on fire. The wizard and his accomplices burned inside, and the sisters were free. Many grim stories carry the same warning. Not every house is a home. Not every promise of marriage leads to happiness. And sometimes the most dangerous place in the forest is the place where someone invites you inside. In the next episode of The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales, we explore the grim story of the Godfather Death. You may try to deceive fate. You may try to bargain with death. But in the end, death always collects what it is owed. If you think you know this story, you might be surprised by what the original version contains. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time, remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. Please come in and have a seat. We're about to begin tonight's amazing tale. Warning: the Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. These stories come from a time when fairy tales were not gentle bedtime stories, but strange and sometimes frightening pieces of folklore passed down through generations. Tonight's tale is one of the most unsettling ever recorded by the Brothers Grimm. It is a story about fate and the danger of trying to escape it. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, these stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales, the versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? Fairy tales were not originally written for children. Long before they appeared in books, they were stories told aloud, shared beside fireplaces, in taverns and in small villages across Europe. They were warnings about the dangers of the world. In the early 19th century, two German scholars, the Brothers Grimm, traveled through villages collecting these stories. What they recorded were not polished fantasies. They were strange, unsettling, and often dark reflections of life and death. Tonight's tale is one of those stories, a tale about a man who chose death itself to stand as godfather to his child. Fairy tale fact: many European folk tales treat death not simply as an end, but as a character. Sometimes death appears as a guide, sometimes as a judge, and sometimes, as in this tale, death becomes something far stranger, a godfather. Series 2, Episode 2, Godfather Death. Long ago there lived a very poor man with 12 children. His family struggled each day simply to survive. When his 13th child was born, the man felt both joy and despair. How could he possibly provide for another child? So he left the house and walked down the road, hoping to find someone worthy to serve as the child's godfather. The first person he met was God himself. God offered to become the godfather, but the poor man shook his head. "You give wealth to the rich," he said, "and leave the poor to suffer." So he walked on. Soon he met the devil. The devil promised riches and power, but the man refused again. "You deceive people," he said. "I will not trust you with my child." Then the man met a third figure walking quietly along the road. This figure was thin and pale, and its bones showed clearly beneath its skin. It was Death. The man looked at Death carefully and said, "You treat everyone the same, rich or poor, young or old. You take us all in the end." Death nodded slowly. "That is true," Death replied. And so the man chose Death to be the child's godfather. Death accepted. As the boy grew older, Death returned to visit him and offered him a gift. Death made the boy a physician, but he gave him one rule. Whenever the boy was called to treat a sick person, Death would appear beside the bed. If Death stood at the head of the bed, the doctor could cure the patient. But if Death stood at the foot of the bed, the patient must die. "Never try to cheat me," Death warned. The young doctor followed these rules faithfully. Soon he became famous. Whenever he entered a room, he would glance around until he saw Death. If Death stood at the head of the bed, he gave medicine and the patient recovered. If Death stood at the foot of the bed, he simply shook his head and left. Word of his strange success spread across the land. Eventually the king himself fell gravely ill. The doctor was summoned to the royal palace. When he entered the room, he saw Death standing at the foot of the bed. The king was meant to die. But the doctor hesitated. The king was powerful, and the reward for saving him would be enormous. So the doctor did something dangerous. He quietly turned the bed around so that Death now stood at the head. Then he gave the king medicine, and the king recovered. Death said nothing, but his hollow eyes burned with anger. Later, Death came for the doctor and said, "You have betrayed me." Still, Death offered him one last chance. Death led the doctor deep into a cavern beneath the earth. Inside the cave were thousands upon thousands of candles. Each candle represented a human life. Some candles burned brightly. Others flickered weakly. Death walked slowly among them and pointed to a tiny candle barely clinging to its flame. "This is your life," Death said. The doctor trembled. "Please," he begged, "light me a new candle." Death pretended to agree. He lifted a fresh candle and began to tilt it toward the dying flame. But as the doctor watched hopefully, Death let the small candle fall. The flame went out, and the doctor's life ended. For Death keeps his promises, but never forgets a betrayal. Please don't leave yet. We have another strange tale from the Brothers Grimm that you need to hear. The Hand with the Knife. In another grim tale, a man was falsely accused of murder. Despite his innocence, he was sentenced to death. But before he died, he swore that the truth would eventually be revealed. Years later, strange events began to occur. At night, a ghostly hand appeared in the town. The hand held a knife. It pointed silently toward a certain house. The townspeople became frightened. Each night the hand returned, pointing again and again toward the same door. Finally, the authorities searched the house. Inside they discovered the real murderer, along with the hidden weapon. The innocent man had spoken the truth. Even after death, the truth had found its way into the world. For in many old tales, justice does not always come quickly, but it always comes. The Grimm stories often remind us of a simple truth. You may try to deceive fate. You may try to bargain with death. But in the end, death always collects what it is owed. On the next episode of the Dark Origins of Fairy Tales, we explore the Grimm story of Bearskin, a tale involving many European folk tales. The devil appears not as a distant ruler of hell, but as a traveler on lonely roads. He tempts the desperate. He offers bargains. And almost always, those bargains come with conditions that test the limits of human endurance. If you think you know this story, you might be surprised by what the original version contains. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time, remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. Please come in and have a seat. We're about to begin a new, strange tale. Warning. The Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. Many of the stories recorded in the earliest fairy tale collections were never meant for children. They were darker, stranger, and often carried warnings about temptation, survival, and the unseen forces that shape human fate. Tonight's story is one of those tales, a story about a soldier, a terrible bargain, and 7 long years spent walking the earth as something barely human. Long before fairy tales were softened for children. These stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales, the versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? Long before fairy tales were printed in books, they lived in the spoken traditions of villages across Europe. They were told around hearth fires, in taverns, and in quiet homes where families gathered at the end of the day. Many of these stories were not about magic or happily ever after. They were about hardship, about the devil, fate, and the dangerous bargains people sometimes make when they feel they have no other choice. In the early 19th century, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany collecting these old tales. What they preserved was not polished fantasy, but raw folklore, stories shaped by centuries of human fear, hope, and survival. Tonight's tale is one of the strangest they ever recorded. Fairy tale fact. In many European folk tales, the devil appears not as a distant ruler of hell, but as a traveller on lonely roads. He tempts the desperate. He offers bargains, and almost always those bargains come with conditions that test the limits of human endurance. Series 2, Episode 3, The Bear Skin. Long ago, after a terrible war, a soldier returned home with nothing. The years of fighting had left him poor, weary, and without work. No one wished to hire a man who had spent so many years on the battlefield. One evening, as the soldier walked alone along a forest road, a stranger appeared before him. The stranger wore a fine green coat and spoke politely, but the soldier quickly realized who stood before him. It was the devil. The devil made the soldier an offer. "If you will serve me for 7 years," the devil said, "I will make you richer than any man in the land." The soldier hesitated. "What must I do?" he asked. The devil explained the terms of the bargain. For 7 years, the soldier must wear a bearskin cloak. During those 7 years, he must never wash himself, cut his hair, trim his nails, or pray. He must live as a wandering outcast. But in return, the soldier would receive a purse that always contained gold. No matter how much he spent, the purse would never empty. If the soldier survived the 7 years, the gold would remain his forever. If he died before the time ended, his soul would belong to the devil. The soldier thought carefully. He had nothing left to lose, and so he agreed. The devil placed the heavy bearskin cloak upon his shoulders. From that moment forward, the soldier began to change. As the months passed, he grew filthy and wild. His beard grew long, his nails became like claws, The bearskin cloak hung from him like the hide of some great beast. Soon people began calling him Bearskin. Wherever he traveled, people recoiled in fear. Children ran away. Doors slammed shut. No one wished to come near him. But Bearskin did something unexpected. Whenever he met the poor, he gave them gold from his endless purse. Slowly, stories began to spread about the strange creature who wandered the roads. A monster who gave money to beggars. One day, Bearskin arrived at a small village and entered an inn. Inside sat an old man who looked deeply troubled. Bearskin asked what was wrong. The man explained that he had fallen into terrible debt. If he could not pay what he owed, he would lose his home. Bearskin quietly handed the man a large purse of gold. The old man was overwhelmed with gratitude. "You have saved my life," he said. "I wish I could repay you somehow." After thinking for a moment, the old man made an offer. "You may marry one of my daughters." Bearskin agreed. But when the daughters saw him, 2 of them ran away in terror. Only the youngest remained. Though she was frightened, she remembered what Bearskin had done for her father. She agreed to marry him. Bearskin gave her half of a ring as a promise. "If I return in 3 years," he said, "we shall be married." Then he left to complete the remaining years of his strange bargain. When the 7th year finally ended, the devil returned. But Bearskin had survived. The devil growled with frustration, but honored the agreement. He removed the bearskin cloak and restored the soldier's appearance. The soldier washed, cut his hair, and dressed in fine clothes. He no longer looked like a monster. When he returned to the village, the young woman did not recognize him at first. But when he showed her the half-ring, she understood. And so the strange man, once called Bearskin, finally found peace after 7 long years of suffering. Please don't leave yet. We have another strange Brothers Grimm tale for you to enjoy. The Devil with the 3 Golden Hairs. In another Grimm tale, a child was born with a strange prophecy. It was said that one day the boy would marry the king's daughter. The king did not like this prophecy at all. Determined to prevent it, the king attempted to dispose of the child. But fate has a strange way of protecting those it favors. The boy survived and grew into a clever young man. Eventually, the king set him an impossible task. If the young man wished to marry the princess, he must travel to the underworld and retrieve 3 golden hairs from the devil's head. The journey was dangerous, but the young man was clever. With the help of the devil's grandmother, he managed to pluck the golden hairs while the devil slept. Each hair revealed secrets that would later solve several mysteries along the road. When the young man returned, the king could no longer deny the prophecy, and so the boy who was once nearly destroyed by fate became the king's son-in-law. The Grimm tales often remind us that fate can take many forms. Sometimes it appears as a wandering devil on a lonely road. Sometimes it waits patiently for 7 long years. And sometimes the strangest bargains lead to the most unexpected endings. In the next episode of The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales, we explore the grim story of Bluebeard. A tale involving oldest fairy tales were never meant to comfort. They were meant to warn about curiosity, about secrets, and about the dangers that sometimes hide behind locked doors. If you think you know this story, you might be surprised by what the original version contains. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time, remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told. Hello, welcome or welcome back. Please have a seat. We're about to begin a new strange tale. Warning. The Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. Many of the stories collected in early folklore were never meant to be comforting bedtime tales. They were warnings about curiosity, temptation, and the hidden dangers that sometimes lie behind closed doors. Tonight's story is one of the most chilling tales ever told in European folklore. A story about a wealthy man with a terrible secret, and a door that should never have been opened. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, these stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales. The versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? Before fairy tales were printed in books or softened for children, they lived in the spoken traditions of villages across Europe. These stories were shared beside fireplaces, in taverns, and in quiet homes where families gathered at the end of the day. They were not always gentle stories. Many were warnings about the dangers of the world. In the 17th century, the French writer Charles Perrault recorded one of the most famous versions of tonight's tale. But similar stories existed in European folklore long before that. Stories about a forbidden room, a mysterious husband, and a terrible discovery waiting behind a locked door. Fairy tale fact. The story of Bluebeard may have been inspired by legends surrounding medieval noblemen who were rumored to have committed terrible crimes. Some historians have even suggested that the tale echoes stories connected to figures like Gilles de Rais, though the connection remains debated. Regardless of its origin, the tale became one of the most famous warnings in folklore about curiosity and hidden danger. Series 2, Episode 4, Bluebeard. Long ago there lived a wealthy man whose beard was an unusual and unsettling shade of blue. People called him Bluebeard. Though he possessed enormous wealth, fine houses, gold, jewels, and lands, many people felt uneasy around him. Something about the man made others uncomfortable, and rumors followed him wherever he went. Bluebeard had been married several times before, but no one knew what had happened to his previous wives. One day, Bluebeard asked a neighboring family if he might marry one of their daughters. The sisters were unsure. The man was wealthy, yes, but his strange appearance and troubling rumors made them nervous. Bluebeard invited the family to spend several days at his grand estate. There were lavish feasts, music, hunting parties, and celebrations. Slowly the youngest daughter began to feel that perhaps Bluebeard was not so frightening after all. Eventually she agreed to marry him. After the wedding, they lived happily for a short time. Then one day, Bluebeard announced he must travel on business. Before leaving, he handed his new wife a ring of keys. "These keys open every room in the house," he said. "You may explore the halls, the treasure rooms, and the gardens as you please." Then he held up one small key. But this key opens a small room at the end of the corridor. You must never enter that room." His wife promised she would obey. After Bluebeard left, curiosity slowly began to grow in her mind. At first she resisted, but the thought of the forbidden room would not leave her. Eventually, curiosity overcame her caution. She walked down the corridor. Her hands trembled as she placed the key in the lock. The door creaked open. Inside the room she saw a terrible sight. The bodies of Bluebeard's former wives hung from the walls. The floor was stained with blood. Horrified, she dropped the key. When she picked it up again, she saw that the key had been stained with blood. No matter how much she scrubbed it, the blood would not come off. When Bluebeard returned, he immediately asked for the keys. As he examined them, his eyes stopped on the small key. The bloodstain was still there. "You have opened the forbidden room," he said coldly. His wife fell to her knees and begged for mercy. But Bluebeard showed none. "You must die," he said. He gave her only a short time to pray before her execution. The terrified woman ran to the top of the tower and asked her sister to watch the road. "Do you see our brothers coming?" she asked. "Not yet," her sister replied. Time passed. Bluebeard grew impatient. Finally, just as he raised his sword to strike, the sound of horses thundered across the courtyard. The woman's brothers had arrived. They rushed into the house and confronted Bluebeard. In the struggle that followed, Bluebeard was killed. The terrible secret of the forbidden room was finally revealed, and the young widow inherited Bluebeard's fortune. But she would never forget what she had seen behind that locked door. Please don't leave yet. We have another Brothers Grimm tale for you to enjoy. The Willful Child. In another grim tale, there lived a child who refused to obey its mother. The child ignored every warning and behaved with stubborn defiance. Soon the child became sick and died. But even after burial, strange things began to happen. Each morning the villagers saw something unusual at the grave. A small arm pushed up through the earth. They buried it again. But the next day, the arm rose once more. No matter how many times they pushed it back into the grave, it returned. Finally, the frightened mother struck the arm with a rod. Only then did the arm disappear, and the child finally rest in peace. For in many old tales, disobedience was believed to follow a person even beyond the grave. The oldest fairy tales were never meant to comfort. They were meant to warn about curiosity, about secrets, and about the dangers that sometimes hide behind locked doors. Because once a door like that is opened, the truth can never be unseen. The legend of Bluebeard became so well known that his name entered the language itself. Even today, a man suspected of murdering multiple wives is sometimes described as a Bluebeard. Proof that some fairy tales leave a shadow that lasts for centuries. In the next episode of The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales, we explore the grim story of the 12 Dancing Princesses. A tale involving many of the old fairy tales remind us that the world is full of hidden doors and secret paths. Some lead underground, some lead into enchanted forests, and some lead into mysteries that only the patient and clever can solve. If you think you know this story, you might be surprised by what the original version contains. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time. Remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told. Hello, welcome or welcome back. Please come in and have a seat. We're about to begin another new strange tale. Warning. The Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. Many fairy tales were never meant to be harmless bedtime stories. Long before they were softened for children, these stories were strange puzzles, warnings, and mysteries passed down through generations. Tonight's tale is one of the most curious stories ever recorded in European folklore. It is a story about 12 princesses, worn-out dancing shoes, and a secret hidden deep beneath the earth. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, these stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales, the versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? Before fairy tales were written in books, they lived in the spoken traditions of villages across Europe. They were told beside fireplaces, in crowded taverns and in quiet homes where families gathered after the day's work was done. Some were warnings about danger. Some were lessons about greed or curiosity. Others were riddles, mysteries meant to challenge the listener. In the early 19th century, the Brothers Grimm traveled through Germany collecting these old stories. What they preserved were not polished fantasies, but fragments of folklore shaped by centuries of storytelling. Tonight's story is one of those mysteries. Fairy tale fact. The tale of the 12 dancing princesses belongs to a category of folklore known as mystery tales. In many of these stories, the hero must solve an impossible puzzle or uncover a hidden secret. In this case, the mystery seems simple at first. Why do 12 princesses destroy their dancing shoes every single night? But many men would lose their lives trying to answer that question. Series 2, Episode 5. The 12 Dancing Princesses. Long ago there was a king who had 12 daughters. They were all beautiful, and they slept together in a great chamber with 12 beds. Every night the king carefully locked the door to their room, but every morning something strange happened. The princesses' dancing shoes were completely worn through, as if they had been dancing all night. The king could not understand how this was possible. He searched the room. He questioned his daughters, but none of them would reveal the truth. Finally, the king made a proclamation. Any man who could discover where the princesses went each night would be allowed to marry one of them and inherit the kingdom. But if he failed, he would be put to death. Many brave princes tried. Each night they were given a place to sleep in the princess's chamber so they could watch what happened. But every morning, the result was the same. The princess's shoes were worn through, and the princes knew nothing. One by one they failed, and paid with their lives. One day, a poor soldier returning from war heard about the king's challenge. On the road he met an old woman. She warned him not to drink the wine the princesses would give him that night. "They will try to make you sleep," she said. She also gave him a cloak that would make him invisible. That evening the soldier arrived at the palace. Just as the old woman predicted, the eldest princess handed him a cup of wine. but the soldier secretly poured it away. Soon he pretended to fall asleep. When the princesses believed he was sleeping, they laughed and prepared to leave. The eldest princess tapped her bed, and suddenly it sank through the floor. Beneath it appeared a hidden staircase leading deep underground. The soldier quickly put on the invisible cloak and followed them. They descended into a strange underground world. The first forest they passed through had trees made entirely of silver. The next forest shimmered with leaves of gold. The third forest glittered with branches made of diamonds. Beyond the forests stood a great lake. 12 princes waited there with boats. Each princess stepped into a boat, and the boats crossed the lake to a brightly lit castle. Inside the castle there was music and dancing. All night long the princesses danced with their mysterious partners. Only when dawn began to approach did they return to the palace. The soldier followed them the entire time. Before leaving each forest, he broke off a branch as proof. After 3 nights, he returned to the king and revealed the secret. He presented the silver, gold, and diamond branches as evidence. The princesses could no longer deny the truth. The soldier chose the eldest princess as his bride. And so the mystery of the worn dancing shoes was finally solved. Please don't leave yet. We have another dark tale from the Brothers Grimm for you to enjoy. The 7 Ravens. In another grim tale, a man and woman had 7 sons and 1 daughter. One day, while preparing water for their baby sister's baptism, the 7 brothers accidentally broke the pitcher. Their father became angry and shouted a terrible curse. Instantly the boys were transformed into ravens and flew away. Years passed. The sister grew up and eventually learned the truth about what had happened to her brothers. Determined to save them, she set out on a dangerous journey. Her path took her across mountains and through strange lands until she reached the edge of the world. There she discovered the secret that could break the spell, but it required a terrible sacrifice. To unlock the enchanted door where her brothers were trapped, she had to cut off one of her own fingers to use as a key. She did so without hesitation. When the door opened, the curse was finally broken. The ravens transformed back into her brothers, and the family was reunited once again. Many of the old fairy tales remind us that the world is full of hidden doors and secret paths. Some lead underground. Some lead into enchanted forests, and some lead into mysteries that only the patient and clever can solve, because sometimes the greatest secrets are hidden in the simplest question. Why were the princesses dancing every night? In the next episode of the Dark Origins of Fairy Tales, we explore the grim story of the Goose Girl. A tale involving many fairy tales tell us that truth has a strange way of surviving. It may be hidden, it may be buried, but sooner or later, someone reveals it. Sometimes it is a whisper, sometimes it is a witness, and sometimes it is the voice of a horse speaking from beyond the grave. If you think you know this story, you might be surprised by what the original version contains. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time, remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. Please come in, have a seat. We're about to begin a new strange tale. Warning: the Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. The earliest fairy tales were never meant to be simple bedtime stories. Many of them were strange, unsettling tales about betrayal, deception, and justice. Tonight's story is one of the most unusual ever collected from European folklore. It is a story about a princess whose identity is stolen, a loyal horse who continues to speak even after death, and the strange way truth eventually finds its way into the light. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, these stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales, the versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? Long before fairy tales appeared in books, they existed as stories told aloud across Europe. They were shared beside fireplaces, in village taverns, and among families at the end of long days of work. Some of these stories were warnings, others were riddles, and some were strange tales of magic, betrayal, and hidden identity. In the early 19th century, the Brothers Grimm traveled through Germany gathering these old stories. They recorded them as they were told, strange details and all. And few tales are stranger than the story of the Goose Girl. Fairy tale fact: many fairy tales include what folklorists call truth-revealing magic. This means that even when a villain hides their crime, something supernatural eventually exposes the truth. In the story of the Goose Girl, that role is played by a horse named Falada. Even after death, Falada's head continues to speak, revealing what really happened to the princess. Series 2, Episode 6, The Goose Girl. Long ago, a queen prepared her daughter for a journey to a distant kingdom. The princess was to travel there and marry a prince she had never met. The queen packed jewels, gold, and fine clothing for the journey. She also sent along a waiting maid to accompany the princess. Before leaving, the queen placed a small charm around her daughter's neck. Inside the charm were drops of the queen's own blood. "This will protect you," the queen said. The princess also rode her beloved horse, Falada. The journey was long, and soon the maid began to grow resentful of her mistress. One day, while traveling through a lonely place, the princess became thirsty. She asked the maid to fetch water from a nearby stream. The maid refused. "If you want water," she said coldly, "you can fetch it yourself." As the princess bent to drink from the stream, the charm around her neck slipped off and fell into the water. Without its protection, the princess was suddenly vulnerable. The maid seized her chance. She forced the princess to exchange clothes with her. Then she threatened to kill her if she ever revealed the truth. When they finally arrived at the prince's kingdom, the maid presented herself as the princess. And the real princess was forced into silence. Instead of becoming a bride, she was given a humble job tending geese. And so the true princess became known as the Goose Girl. The false princess ordered something else as well. She demanded that the horse, Falada, be killed. She feared the horse might reveal the truth. The king agreed, but the Goose Girl secretly asked the stable boy to hang Falada's head on the city gate. Every morning she passed beneath the gate while driving the geese to pasture, and each morning she whispered, "Falada, there you hang." To which the horse's head replied, "If your mother knew what had been done to you, her heart would surely break in two." The boy who tended the geese overheard this strange conversation. He reported it to the old king. The king began to suspect something was wrong. So one day he hid behind a gate and watched. Again the goose girl spoke to the horse's head. Again the horse replied. The king realized that a terrible deception had taken place. He questioned the goose girl, but she was afraid to accuse the false princess. Finally the king told her to speak her troubles to the iron stove in the courtyard. Believing no one could hear her, the goose girl told the entire story. But the king was listening. The truth had finally been revealed. The false princess was confronted, and according to the harsh justice of the old tales, she was punished for her betrayal. The real princess was restored to her rightful place, and at last she married the prince she had been promised. Please don't leave yet. We have another strange, dark tale for you to enjoy. The White Bride and the Black One. In another grim tale, a beautiful young woman known as the White Bride set out on a journey to meet the prince she was destined to marry. Traveling with her was a jealous servant. During the journey, the servant attacked the young woman and stole her fine clothing. She then presented herself to the prince as the bride. The true bride was forced to remain silent and live in disguise. For a time, the deception succeeded. But as often happens in the old fairy tales, the truth eventually began to reveal itself. Strange events and whispers of doubt slowly uncovered the servant's betrayal. When the prince finally discovered the truth, the false bride faced a terrible punishment for her crime, and the rightful bride was restored to her place. Many fairy tales tell us that truth has a strange way of surviving. It may be hidden, it may be buried, but sooner or later, something reveals it. Sometimes it is a whisper, sometimes it is a witness, and sometimes it is the voice of a horse speaking from beyond the grave. In the next episode of The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales, we explore the grim story of the Devil's Sooty Brother. A tale involving many of the old fairy tales remind us of something simple. Be careful what bargains you make, whether with kings, with strangers, or with the devil himself. If you think you know this story, you might be surprised by what the original version contains. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time, remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told. Hello, welcome, and/or welcome back. Please have a seat. We're about to begin another new dark tale. Warning: the Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. Many of the earliest fairy tales were not about magic kingdoms or happily ever after. They were about survival, about desperate bargains made in dark places, and sometimes about dealing directly with the devil himself. Tonight's story is one of the strangest tales collected from European folklore, the story of a soldier who agreed to work for the devil for 7 years. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, These stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales, the versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? Before fairy tales were written down, they were passed from one generation to the next through spoken storytelling. They were told in taverns, beside fireplaces, and in villages across Europe. These stories often reflected the fears and beliefs of the time: poverty, war, death, and the ever-present idea that supernatural forces might interfere in human lives. In the early 19th century, the Brothers Grimm traveled through Germany gathering these old tales. They preserved them much as they were told. Strange, unsettling details included, and few are stranger than the story of the devil's sooty brother. Fairy tale fact. In many European folk traditions, the devil is not always portrayed as an unstoppable force of evil. Instead, he often appears as a trickster figure, sometimes clever, sometimes foolish. And more than once, the heroes of these stories manage to outwit him. But escaping a deal with the devil is never easy. Series 2, Episode 7, The Devil's Sooty Brother. Once there was a soldier who had returned from war with nothing, no money, no home, no future. As he wandered the road, a mysterious stranger approached him. The stranger asked if the soldier wanted work. The soldier agreed. But the stranger soon revealed who he truly was. It was the devil. The devil offered the soldier a bargain. For 7 years, the soldier would serve him in the underworld. If he completed the work, he would return to the world richer than he had ever imagined. But if he failed, he would belong to the devil forever. With little left to lose, the soldier accepted. The devil led him down into a dark place beneath the earth. There the soldier was given a simple task. He was to tend the fires beneath enormous iron kettles. Inside the kettles boiled the souls of the damned. The devil gave him one very important warning. Never lift the lids from the kettles. Curiosity is a dangerous thing. And before long the soldier could not resist. He lifted the lid of the first kettle. Inside was a powerful king he had once served. The king begged the soldier to stir the fire beneath him. The soldier did so. Then he lifted the lid of the second kettle. Inside was another familiar face. Soon he lifted the lid of the third kettle. Each time he stirred the flames as the trapped souls requested. But the devil discovered what he had done. Instead of punishing him, the devil simply laughed. Because the soldier had been clever enough to follow the rest of his instructions. For 7 long years the soldier tended the fires of hell. During that time, he never washed, never cut his hair, and never cleaned the soot that covered his skin. By the end of his service, he was black with soot from head to toe. When the 7 years were finished, the devil kept his promise. He filled the soldier's pockets with gold, then he sent him back to the world above. But when people saw the soldier's appearance, they were terrified. No one would let him enter their homes. No one would speak to him. Until one day, he came to the house of a poor innkeeper. The innkeeper allowed him to stay. During the evening, the soldier gave the innkeeper's daughters gold coins. Soon his generosity began to change the way people saw him. Eventually the soldier married the innkeeper's youngest daughter, and although he had once worked for the devil himself, he lived the rest of his life as a wealthy and respected man. Please don't leave yet. We have another dark tale for you to enjoy. The Three Snake Leaves. Another grim tale tells the story of a young man who devoted his life to serving a princess. When the princess fell ill and died, the young man refused to accept her death. He stayed beside her coffin in mourning. While he sat there, 3 snakes slithered into the chamber. The young man killed one of them, but the remaining snakes placed 3 mysterious leaves on their fallen companion. To his amazement, the dead snake returned to life. The young man took the leaves and used them on the princess, and she rose from the dead. But sometimes the dead do not return unchanged. After marrying the young man who saved her, the princess eventually betrayed him. She plotted his death during a sea voyage. But the truth of her betrayal was discovered, and the man who had once brought her back to life watched as she was cast into the sea. Many of the old fairy tales remind us of something simple. Be careful what bargains you make, whether with kings, with strangers, or with the devil himself, because sometimes the price is higher than anyone expects. In the next episode of The Dark Origins of Fairy Tales, we explore the grim story of the Devil's Grandmother, our series finale. A tale involving many of the oldest fairy tales teach a simple lesson. Power does not always win. Sometimes survival depends on cleverness. Sometimes it depends on luck. And sometimes the only way to defeat the devil is to ask his grandmother for help. If you think you know this story, you might be surprised by what the original version contains. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time. Remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told. Hello, welcome, or welcome back. Please have a seat. We're about to start another new dark tale. Warning. The Ember and Ink Studios are not responsible for ruining your childhood. Proceed with caution. The fairy tales recorded in early European folklore were not always stories about magic kingdoms and happy endings. Many were tales about survival, about clever people outwitting powerful enemies, and sometimes about escaping the devil himself. Tonight's story is one of the strangest collected by the Brothers Grimm. It is a story about 3 soldiers, a dangerous bargain, and the one person even the devil might fear: his grandmother. Long before fairy tales were softened for children, these stories were darker. They were tales of betrayal, revenge, strange magic, and sometimes terrible justice. In the early 1800s, the Brothers Grimm traveled across Germany, collecting these stories from villagers, travelers, and storytellers. What they preserved were not the gentle bedtime stories we know today. They were the original versions, forgotten, unsettling, and sometimes shocking. Welcome to the dark origins of fairy tales, the versions they never told you. What is a fairy tale? Before fairy tales were written down, they were told from one generation to the next as spoken stories. Villagers shared them in taverns, beside fireplaces, and during long winter nights. These stories reflected the fears and hopes of ordinary people: war, poverty, strange encounters with supernatural forces. When the Brothers Grimm began collecting these tales in the early 19th century, they preserved many of these unusual stories just as they were told. Stories where ordinary people sometimes managed to survive encounters with creatures far more powerful than themselves. Tonight's tale is one of those stories. Fairy tale fact. In many European folk traditions, the devil is not always unbeatable. While he is powerful, he is often tricked by clever humans, sometimes by peasants, sometimes by soldiers, and sometimes by members of his own family. Series 2, Episode 8, The Devil's Grandmother. Long ago, during a terrible war, 3 soldiers found themselves fleeing across a battlefield. The enemy was close behind them, and they had nowhere left to run. As they crossed a lonely field, a stranger suddenly appeared before them. The man wore a dark coat and smiled in a way that made the soldiers uneasy. But the soldiers soon realized who stood before them. It was the devil. The devil offered them a bargain. He would hide them from their enemies and allow them to live in safety for 7 years. But when the 7 years were over, their souls would belong to him. The soldiers had little choice. They agreed. The devil led them to a hidden underground place where they would live during those 7 years. But he warned them of one thing. After the 7 years ended, he would ask each of them 3 riddles. If they could answer correctly, they would be free. If not, they would belong to him forever. The soldiers accepted the terms. 7 long years passed. When the time came, the devil returned and gave them the riddles. The soldiers realized immediately that they had no idea what the answers were. Terrified, they wandered through the forest, trying to find some way to escape their fate. Eventually they came upon a small cottage. Inside lived a very old woman. The soldiers told her their story. The old woman listened carefully. Then she smiled. The soldiers had unknowingly found the home of the devil's own grandmother. She agreed to help them, but she warned them they must hide. Soon the devil himself arrived to visit her. He sat beside the fire and began boasting about how clever his riddles were. As he spoke, the grandmother quietly asked him about them. Proud of his trickery, the devil revealed the answers. Hidden nearby, the soldiers listened carefully. When the time came for the devil to test them, the soldiers calmly answered each riddle. The devil realized immediately that he had been outsmarted. But a bargain was a bargain. Furious though he was, the devil had no choice but to let them go. And so, the 3 soldiers escaped the fate that had nearly claimed their souls, thanks to the help of the one person who knew the devil best, his grandmother. Please don't leave yet. We have another dark Brothers Grimm tale for you to enjoy. The Devil's 3 Questions. In another European folk tale, the devil once challenged a poor farmer with 3 questions. If the farmer failed to answer them, his soul would belong to the devil. The farmer had no idea how to respond. But when the devil returned to hear the answers, the farmer spoke with confidence. Each answer cleverly twisted the devil's own logic. One by one, the questions were solved. The devil realized too late that he had once again been defeated by a simple human trick. For in many old tales, the devil's greatest weakness is not power. It is pride. Many of the oldest fairy tales teach a simple lesson. Power does not always win. Sometimes, survival depends on cleverness. Sometimes it depends on luck, and sometimes the only way to defeat the devil is to ask his grandmother for help. The Ember and Ink Studios would like to thank you for listening to this episode. If there is a dark, grim tale you would like to hear explored in a future episode, please leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing, turning on notifications, and giving the video a like. That way you'll never miss the next journey into the darker side of folklore. Until next time, remember, the stories we grew up with are rarely the ones that were first told.